All right, so get this for today's deep dive. We're actually using a language learning podcast episode as our source material.
Interesting.
And you know what? It's perfect because we're going to help you get more comfortable talking about your daily routine in English.
Okay.
You know, all those everyday things.
Right.
But using the right words and phrases can be tricky in another language.
Yeah, for sure.
So what's really clever about this episode is that it doesn't just throw a bunch of vocabulary at you.
Yeah.
It focuses on giving you the tools to actually use those words in real conversations.
It's true. And you know what I think is really smart about it is it breaks down common daily activities into like manageable chunks.
Yeah.
You know, waking up, getting ready, having breakfast.
Things everyone does.
Exactly, things everyone does. But it's like,
But have you ever noticed how even describing these simple things in English can sometimes feel like a tongue twister?
yeah, sometimes I think we forget how important it is to actually master basic vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
It's like building a house.
Mm.
You need a solid foundation before you can add on that fancy roof.
Okay, so speaking of foundations, this podcast episode does a really good job of laying out those essential building blocks,
Right.
but it goes a step further, and this is what I find fascinating.
Okay.
It incorporates these clever techniques to help you actually remember and use the vocabulary.
You're talking about the use of repetition and contextualized examples.
Yes.
And, you know, research actually shows that these methods can really boost vocabulary retention.
Yeah.
It's not just about hearing the words, it's about actively engaging with them.
Exactly. Like, for example, it doesn't just say, here's the word for morning.
Right.
It gives you a whole sentence like, I wake up at 7 a.m. in the morning, and then it has you repeat it.
It's true.
It's like they're building those neural pathways in your brain right there on the spot.
Yeah, and by embedding the vocabulary within a real-life scenario,
Right.
it helps you visualize the situation and connect the words to like a concrete experience. It's so much more effective than just memorizing isolated words from a list.
Right. Yeah. And you know, it's funny you mentioned real life scenarios because that leads me to another thing I wanted to bring up.
Okay.
The episode specifically talks about time expressions, you know, morning, afternoon, evening. But it got me thinking, have you ever noticed how different cultures actually divide up the day in slightly different ways?
That's such a good observation.
Yeah.
And it highlights how language isn't just about words.
Right.
It's about reflecting a culture's perception of time.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, what one culture might consider late afternoon, another might still classify as like early evening.
Right. And these subtle differences can lead to some interesting misunderstandings.
Oh, for sure.
Especially when you're first learning a new language.
Oh, tell me you have a story. I love a good language mix-up anecdote.
Uh-huh. Well, let's just say trying to schedule a meeting in another country taught me the hard way that afternoon.
Oh, no.
Doesn't always mean the same thing
Okay.
everywhere. But it's those kinds of experiences that make you realize just how much culture is woven into the fabric of language.
Absolutely. And the fact that this language learning podcast touches upon these cultural nuances is a testament to its depth.
Yeah.
It's going beyond just teaching you how to speak. It's giving you a glimpse into a different way of seeing the world.
And that, I think, is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because learning a new language isn't just about acquiring vocabulary and grammar.
Right.
It's about broadening your perspective and understanding how those seemingly small differences in language reflect much larger cultural values.
For sure.
Now, before we get too philosophical here, I do want to highlight one more thing this podcast episode does exceptionally well.
Right.
It moves beyond just explaining concepts.
Yeah.
And actually gives you the chance to put what you're learning into practice.
You're referring to the interactive elements, right?
Yes.
The way the host encourages listeners to repeat phrases and answer questions.
Yes, and it's not just about rote repetition.
Right.
They actually incorporate these really clever techniques that are backed by research on language acquisition.
Interesting.
For example, they use a lot of what's called active recall,
Okay.
which is where they ask you a question that forces you to retrieve information from memory.
Oh, yeah.
And studies have shown that this process of active retrieval actually strengthens those neural connections in your brain,
Wow.
making it more likely that you'll remember the information long term.
It's like giving your brain a little workout.
Yes.
And the more you challenge it, the stronger it becomes.
Right. But what I find particularly effective is that this podcast doesn't just rely on passive learning techniques.
Right.
It actually encourages you to actively engage in conversation.
But yeah, it's all about putting those words and phrases into action.
Speaking of action, there's one part of this episode that I found particularly fun and engaging.
Are you talking about that challenge the host throws out there?
Yes. The one where they ask you to translate a routine from another language into English.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
It's a brilliant way to apply what you've learned in a creative and practical way. And it highlights the fact that language learning doesn't have to be dry and boring.
Right.
It can be playful and even a little bit challenging.
It's like turning language learning into a game.
Yeah.
Which, let's be honest, makes it way more enjoyable.
Totally.
And speaking of enjoying the process, I think this podcast does a fantastic job of...
Hold on a second before we move on.
Okay.
I want to pick up on something you said earlier.
Okay.
You mentioned that this challenge reminded you of active recall.
Mm-hmm.
And it got me thinking about something else. Gamification.
Okay.
This challenge isn't just a random fun activity.
Right.
It's actually a cleverly disguised learning tool.
Ooh. I like where you're going with this.
By framing language learning as a game or a challenge, it taps into our natural desire for competition and accomplishment.
And when we're engaged and having fun, we're much more likely to retain information.
That's a great point. It's like sneaking in the learning while we're distracted by the game.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is that this seemingly simple challenge actually has some pretty sophisticated pedagogical theory behind it.
Exactly. And that, I think, speaks volumes about the thoughtfulness and care that went into creating this podcast.
Yeah.
It's not just about entertainment.
Right.
It's about effective learning disguised as entertainment.
And that's a winning combination in my book. Now, speaking of winning combinations, I think this podcast has a real knack for...
Okay, what is it?
Well, we'll have to save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, I can't wait. It's fascinating how this language learning podcast manages to pack so much into such a short episode. We've talked about vocabulary, cultural nuances, interactive exercises, and even a bit of learning theory.
And we've only just scratched the surface, but I think what really impressed me is how seamlessly it weaves together all these different elements to create a truly engaging and effective learning experience.
Yeah, it's like a well-choreographed dance, with each step building upon the previous one. It starts with those fundamental building blocks of vocabulary and then gradually layers on complexity, introducing grammar concepts, cultural insights, and opportunities for practice, all while keeping the tone light and encouraging.
And that brings me to something I wanted to get your take on. We talked earlier about how the podcast emphasizes using time expressions accurately. But honestly, I've always found those little prepositions, at, in, on, to be super tricky when it comes to talking about time in English. Have you ever struggled with those?
Oh, absolutely. Prepositions are notorious for being a stumbling block, even for advanced learners.
Yeah.
It's like there's some secret code to cracking their usage, and even native speakers sometimes trip up.
It's true. I've definitely heard my fair share of native English speakers say things like on Monday morning instead of on Monday. It makes you realize that even seemingly simple grammar rules can be surprisingly nuanced.
And those nuances are often where the cultural aspects of language really come into play. The way we conceptualize time and space influences how we use prepositions, and those patterns can vary significantly across languages.
It's so interesting. It's like those tiny prepositions hold a whole world of cultural meaning within them. It reminds me of something we touched on earlier, the idea that language is a window into another culture's way of thinking.
Exactly, and I think the best language learning resources are the ones that recognize this connection and incorporate those cultural insights into the learning process.
This podcast episode certainly seems to do that. Well, it's not just about teaching you how to speak English, it's about helping you understand the culture that shapes the language.
And that, I believe, is what makes language learning truly transformative. It's not just about acquiring a new skill, it's about expanding your worldview and developing a deeper appreciation for the diversity of human experience.
Okay. That was beautifully said. Now, before we get too carried away with the profound implications of prepositions, I do want to bring us back to something a bit more concrete. Remember that challenge we talked about earlier, the one where the podcast host asks you to translate a routine from another language into English?
Ah, yes. The ultimate test of comprehension and application. I love how they incorporated that. It forces you to think critically about the language and to put your newfound knowledge to the test.
It's like they're saying, okay, you've learned the vocabulary, you've grasped the grammar now, let's see if you can actually use it in a real-world scenario.
And it's brilliant because it encourages you to move beyond passive learning and to actively engage with the language. It's not enough to just understand the concepts you have to be able to apply them.
Speaking of application, this whole idea of translating routines from another language got me thinking about something we often talk about, the importance of immersion when learning a new language. But what does immersion really look like in everyday life?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that many language learners struggle with. We're often told to immerse ourselves in the language. But what does that actually mean beyond, say, traveling to a country where the language is spoken?
Right, because let's face it, not everyone has the time or resources to pack their bags and jet off to another country. So, how can we create those immersive experiences in our own lives, even if we're stuck in our own little bubble?
I think it starts with being intentional about seeking out opportunities to engage with the language. It could be as simple as watching a movie or TV show in English with subtitles, listening to an English language podcast, or even just changing the language settings on your phone.
It's about making those small, everyday choices that expose you to the language in a natural and authentic way. It's not about forcing yourself to do something you hate. It's about finding ways to make the language a part of your daily routine.
Exactly, and I think the key here is consistency. It's about creating those little pockets of immersion throughout your day, whether it's listening to music while you commute, reading a news article online, or having a conversation with a language partner.
It's about building those habits that make the language a constant presence in your life, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time. And over time, those little moments add up and start to make a real difference.
It's like that old saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. Language learning is a process,
Yeah.
and it's one that requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to embrace the ups and downs along the way.
Speaking of ups and downs, I have to admit I've had my fair share of both when it comes to learning new languages. There are days when I feel like I'm making amazing progress, and then other days when I feel like I'm back at square one.
Oh, I can absolutely relate to that. Language learning is a roller coaster ride filled with moments of triumph and frustration. But I think it's important to remember that those setbacks are a natural part of the process.
It's like learning to ride a bike. You're going to fall a few times before you finally get the hang of it. But the key is to not let those falls discourage you. Get back on the bike and keep pedaling.
And just like learning to ride a bike, the more you practice, the easier it becomes. Those grammar rules that once seemed so confusing start to make sense. The vocabulary words that you struggle to remember become second nature, and suddenly you find yourself speaking more fluently and confidently than you ever thought possible.
It's like a magic trick, but one that you've created through your own hard work and dedication. And that sense of accomplishment, that feeling of having unlocked a new part of your brain is truly exhilarating.
It's a reminder that we're all capable of so much more than we often give ourselves credit for, and that learning a new language is not just about acquiring a skill, it's about pushing our boundaries and discovering hidden potential within ourselves.
And sometimes it's about having a good laugh at our own expense when we make those inevitable language blunders along the way.
Oh, absolutely. Those blunders are often the most memorable parts of the journey. They're the stories we tell and retell, the reminders that even in our moments of imperfection, there's humor and grace to be found.
And those stories often reveal a lot about our own cultural assumptions and the ways in which language can both bridge and highlight those differences.
It's like those moments of linguistic mishaps become these unexpected opportunities for cultural exchange and understanding. We learn not only about the language itself, but also about the people and the culture that shaped it.
Thinking back on everything we've discussed today, I'm struck by how much we can learn from a single language learning podcast episode.
It's a testament to the power of language learning, to open up new worlds of understanding and to connect us to something larger than ourselves.
It all starts with those seemingly mundane daily routines, the words we use to describe our everyday lives, and the hidden cultural meanings embedded within them.
It's a reminder that even in the most ordinary of things, there's extraordinary beauty and complexity to be found.
Beautifully said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but there's one more thought I want to leave our listener with. So, we've talked a lot about how much we can learn from this one little language learning podcast episode.
Right, like it's amazing how much they pack into such a short amount of time.
It is. It's like we've peeled back the layers of language and found these fascinating insights into culture,
Yeah.
you know.
And cognition and even our own personal learning journeys.
Exactly. And we've done it all through the lens of something as seemingly mundane as our daily routines.
It's so true. It just goes to show that even the most ordinary aspects of life can have this extraordinary depth when we take the time to actually examine them.
Yeah, and before we wrap up today, I wanted to kind of circle back to something we touched upon a little earlier, that whole idea that language learning can be a little bit like a roller coaster.
Oh yeah, with its highs and lows.
Yeah, exactly. The inevitable ups and
The
downs.
language learning journey, it's full of them.
Yes, and I think it's so important for anyone who's learning a new language to recognize that those setbacks are like totally normal.
Oh yeah, it's all part of the process.
It is. It's like learning any new skill. Like, there will be times when you feel like you're making huge progress, and then there's other times when you just hit a
You
wall.
feel like you're getting nowhere.
Yeah, and it's easy to get discouraged and be like, okay, I'm done.
Right. Like I give up.
Exactly. And in those moments of frustration, it's so important to kind of remember why you started learning the language in the first place.
Yeah, reconnect with that motivation.
Yes, because ultimately, language learning is about so much more than just, memorizing words and grammar
Right.
rules.
It's about connecting with other cultures, broadening our perspectives, opening ourselves up to new ways of thinking and being.
It's about pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zones.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
embracing that challenge.
Yeah, of communicating in a different language. And let's be honest, it's also about having a few good laughs along the way when we inevitably make those hilarious language blunders.
Hmm. Oh yeah, those blunders are priceless. They're the stories that we'll tell for years to come.
Exactly. They're like these little reminders of our journey and the growth that we've experienced. So as we wrap up this deep dive today, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay, I'm all ears.
We've talked about how our daily routines reflect our cultural values, how language learning can be both like challenging and rewarding, and how even just those little moments of immersion can add up to create some really big changes.
It's amazing how much we can learn when we take the time to really dig deep.
It is, but here's the thing. This is just the beginning of your exploration.
It is.
The real learning happens when you take everything that we've talked about today and you start to apply it to your own life.
Right, like start paying attention to the language that you use in your everyday life, in your daily routines, and start to notice those little ways in which your culture shapes how you see the world.
Yeah, and seek out opportunities to immerse yourself in the English language, even if it's just for a few minutes every day.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah, embrace those blunders.
There are opportunities for growth and learning.
Exactly, because the more you stumble, the stronger you'll become.
And remember, language learning is a journey, not a destination.
So true.
It's about that process of discovery, the joy of connection, and the ongoing expansion of your worldview.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep embracing the beauty and complexity of the English language, and we'll be here to guide you along the way. Until next time, happy learning.